Hi everyone, I'm Siobhan Wright. I'm here to do an oral presentation on my paper Tsu Gani'i, which translates from Kalapuya to English as Where Are They Now? So Tsu Gani'i, how historical genocide of Native Americans has transpired into national apathy toward the current missing and murdered Indigenous women national emergency. To begin, I just need to go ahead and say that I'm using terms like Native American, Indian, Indigenous peoples, Native nations for brevity's sake, right? Our language is not inclusive enough to take into account um, the diversity, the mass diversity of different Native nations. So I'm not using any of those terms in disrespect. I'm simply making those or utilizing that overgeneralization to kind of speak about a specific topic. And I just want to start by acknowledging that. I also want to acknowledge that this is a specific topic that is incredibly relevant now and has been incredibly relevant all throughout history. There are a few more details in my paper, and I'll link that below. A few more details about Native history that I won't cover here for brevity's sake. But I will make references, and so I'm happy to answer any questions or discuss anything, or send anybody to different sites that you can reference. And my paper's got all of the resources that I utilized for my research. So, all right, let's get started. So I'm going to go ahead and read a little bit of my intro. In this paper, I will examine how the historical destruction of Native women through assimilation, eugenics, and violence mirrors the current genocide against Native women. I will also explain how today's current national emergency of missing and murdered Native women is under-investigated and often downright ignored by media and law enforcement in direct support of systemic racism stemming from the initial goal of colonization to exterminate Native culture, right? So, basically, let's start right now. So, right now, what we're seeing is Native women are going missing and being murdered or experiencing violence far more than any other cultural identity group in the United States, right? So we often speak in terms of minorities or ethnic groups, and that's not an appropriate way to distinguish Native Americans, right? They are individual nations, but just for comparison's sake, right? So we'll say white women, non-Hispanic, white women, Hispanic descent, black women, right? So the groups that we are really used to kind of discussing in terms of our cultural identity groups, right? So those groups see nothing compared to the amount of danger that Native American women are in right now. And I mean, I would definitely consider that a national emergency, and it's really something that needs to be addressed, right? So what's happening right now is that people are starting to attack feminism because it's not intersectional enough, right? So and that's that's something that I'm hearing about right now, maybe because I'm of the age to be listening to the news, right? But that's a thing that has occurred since the beginning of time. So when we first started to see these eugenics happening against the Native American population, eugenics being defined specifically here by me as the method of improving the intellectual, economic, and social level of humans through differential reproduction of superior genetics, right? So when we first started to really see that happening, or maybe records being kept of it, was in the 1970s. And so in the 1970s, you saw black women and Native American women encouraged more by their doctors to seek out either tubal ligation or like hysterectomies, so sterilization, the inability to reproduce, um, as like a means of birth control, right? So these two groups versus white women who were encouraged to utilize other forms of birth control, right? So when we first start seeing that in the 1970s, it was like a deliberate choice of white women to ignore that because they were really starting to fight for the right to choose to have abortions. And it was often thought that if they started to put like regulations on things in terms of, okay, well, you can't sterilize these women, then it would translate over into um, like stricter regulations on the work that they were trying to do for abortions, right? So I say all of that just to say that like intersectionality being absent from feminism is not a new thing, but it's starting to change, right? And so one of the things that's becoming really important is that Native American women are literally just like disappearing in droves. And many of them are not, like, it's not even reported because, and there's a lot of different reasons, right? So just like general mistrust in the federal government and the systems and law enforcement in general, right? You see that with basically every marginalized group because every marginalized group is violently attacked by our police. So we have that, right? Just like fear and distrust of the government. But then also, and this kind of alludes back to Native American history, like when, okay, so like when like citizenship became like a right, right? And if you were a naturalized citizen, then you automatically got citizenship. So at that time, Native Americans were still being recognized as their own nations, right? And it took years before it was ever even addressed. So there's always been kind of this like very murky idea of like, are they citizens, but are they nations? And if they're their own nations, then like how can they be on this land that like we have sovereignty over? And I get it, the colonizer standpoint of like, well, if we just like give them the runaround until they're not strong enough to defend themselves against our army, well, then they just have to like take whatever we give them. Excuse me. So, so like, what that translates into now is that it gets really murky when you have to figure out like what jurisdiction is going to take over to offer these people that are contributing to society the resources that they need to be safe, right? So maybe a woman goes and reports her sister or her mother or somebody that she loves missing to tribal police, and they have tons of caseloads because this is an epidemic right now. So then they say, well, reach out to the local police. And the local police say, well, we don't have jurisdiction. If it happened on reservation, then we can't do anything. You have to talk to the federal government, right? So then the FBI says, oh, well, sorry, like we can't do anything because if they're just missing, we don't really have a case, right? So there's just kind of all of this murkiness going on that has for years, which is the reason that the caseloads have piled up. But there is a light at the end of the tunnel, right? So in 2017, there was a bill introduced to the Senate, and that passed. And basically, that just like made the Department of Justice responsible for taking care of these cases that are introduced about Native American women. It did not pass through the House, though, but there are currently representatives working on introducing a new bill. And there's also just like more awareness spreading. So, like, in Montana, and a lot of this happens in the Pacific Northwest, and there are like native nations all over the United States, but I happen to get a lot of my knowledge about Native American culture from tribes that are local here, and a lot of the like movements that I've seen are also occurring up in the Pacific Northwest. The American, what is it? The Native American Museum. Yeah, American Indian Museum. Like, what word? The American Indian Museum. Just this month for Women's History Month, they had like an artist from Canada who is Indigenous. Um, she did like an art exhibit where they hung red dresses from the trees to show like missing women, and maybe I'll be able to find a link to that, but either way it's like cited in my page. But that's something that is really interesting that's going on. um, I mean, really it's just like important to know that this is what's happening. And for years, the goal of the United States government was to literally make these people invisible. And I mean, for the most part, they like succeeded in doing what they wanted, right? Was to just like kind of make this very prominent group almost invisible, either through eugenics or assimilation or murder or putting them on reservations away from like everybody else, just so that, you know, if you don't see them, then there's really no way to like fight for their rights, right? So when you have that happening, when you have like such a systemic and long, like lengthy effort in making these people invisible, then it puts them at a really high risk, because as a criminal, as an abuser, as somebody who wants to commit a violent crime against a woman, like you know that you can choose the women that are not as readily able to defend themselves. Yeah. So I personally, I just knew that in all of my studies about Native American culture, there's been a lack of representation for the women, and so it's just important for me to like seek out that research and share it with other people to make sure that things like this do not continue to happen or ever happen again in our future. So I welcome any questions or comments. I will put a link down below to my paper. Please check it out and let me know what you think. Definitely check out Dr. David Lewis's work. I will also link to that below. I mean, just a trillion articles where you can learn literally everything that happened. If history is your thing, it's like, I mean, he's an amazing archivist, and I mean, you can just go through tons of stuff, and it's all really, really interesting. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope that you enjoyed this and that you learned a little bit about it, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to just opine a little bit about something that's really important to me that I'm learning about, and hopefully we'll talk soon. Thanks.